Hi, my name's Tira Matembu. I work with the Hampton Project, a grassroots coalition dedicated to fighting settler colonial capitalism through creating a solidarity economy for all. Central to our work is housing advocacy. We've seen the conditions on our streets get worse and worse. Today, I'll be joined by Peter Gilmer, a tireless advocate for our community. With close to 30 years of experience at the Anti-Poverty Ministry, no one knows the conditions on our streets better than Peter. Peter, thanks for being with me.
Thanks for having me.
Tell me, how did we get to this mess? How did we get here?
Well, there's been a number of things that have got us into a real housing crisis in the city and the province. One of them is the lack of rent control for many years. I remember that when I started with the Anti-Poverty Ministry, we always were in favor of rent control, but we actually took an official position back in 1997. So it's been 28 years that we've been pushing governments to implement some form of controls on rent. But there's been a few other issues, of course. The fact that non-market-based housing or social housing has been in significant decline over the decades. There was a time where there were many more options where rent was geared to income, but it's largely being controlled by the market. And as corporate ownership of the market, corporate landlords and financialization of rental properties has grown, that's meant that there's been less and less affordable housing on the market. You mix that in with a significant rush of condominium conversions that took place about a decade ago, where a lot of the more affordable units were taken off the market. That certainly played a big role as well. So, and obviously people also just don't have the incomes to meet the rising rents. So it's a combination of factors, but certainly the lack of rent control in this province has been a concern.
Mm-hmm. So I know that April Chief CAF and the NDP are proposing rent control. Now, what would that do? What would you see that doing for our communities?
Well, primarily, the biggest, most important facet of rent control legislation would be capping the amount that rents can be raised in a given year. The only thing that comes close to rent control, and it's really not rent control, but the only limits for landlords when it comes to rent is that they have to give 1 year's notice before they raise the rent. They can only raise it once a year unless they belong to a landlords association, in which case they can raise it every 6 months. And we've always been concerned about the kind of self-regulation of landlords regulating other landlords, that really there needs to be an independent body, or the government really needs to be playing a role there. But the big issue for us has been the big spikes that we've seen over the years, and again recently, whereby rent has risen drastically. And just a little bit of the history on that: between 2006 and 2010, rents in Regina went up by 43%. They went up another 20 between 2010 and 2013. There's never been a year where we've seen a decline in rents, but it did slow a little bit for a while. But in recent years, we're once again leading the country in the rate of rent increases and the amount. So we're seeing regularly 20 and 30% rental increases, which of course prices a lot of people out of their homes and onto the street.
What does this, like, in this most recent years? What are in your work? What are the phone calls? What are your clients? What are you hearing?
Well, one thing I'll mention very recently is we track all the types of cases that we do. And so far in 2025, the number one reason that people call our office is concerns about being able to pay their rent. So rental coverage has risen. Last year, I mean, it's always been high. And there's been a number of years it's been number one. Last year it was utility coverage, but it's kind of the same issue that people have to kind of gain and maintain their utilities in order to maintain their rental properties. So the two are very much combined, but the bottom line is people can't afford their shelter costs.
And where do you see this going? Where do you see us heading in our city?
Well, we certainly have seen some of the worst aspects of it in terms of a growth of the unhoused population. But the other reality in all this is that for every person who's presently unhoused, we know that there's so many more that are on the cusp, and either either they're not sure how they're going to pay their rent, or they're in a position where they're having to sacrifice food security and other basic needs. And one example I would give is that for the folks that we work with on the Saskatchewan Income Support Program, the amount that they receive for a shelter allowance, which is not just for rent but for utilities as well, is only $660 a month. And that's Regina and Saskatoon. It's actually less than that than the rest of the province. So when we look at average rents, many of our clients are paying 80% of their income on rent alone, let alone having to cover utilities. And we also have folks that basically their rent is higher than their total income. So, and for people on the SED program, it's not much better because we've seen the loss of the rental supplement program. We've seen the loss of excess shelter. So people don't have the resources anymore to be able to cover these growths in rent.
Earlier we talked to Harpreet, a renter in North Central, and I know that as bad as the conditions, I've always been amazed at the resilience of our community members. Where do you draw strength for continuing to advocate for our community?
Well, that's certainly part of it, is the resilience of the people that we're working with and their capacity to find ways to make it under just incredibly difficult and harsh conditions. Mind you, whenever I say resilience, I know a lot of the people I work with say, they're tired of being resilient, that ultimately there needs to be protections in place so they don't have to face these types of crises on their own. And it's our sense that whereas corporate landlords and others with wealth and power have the resources to protect their own interests, that governments have a vital responsibility to protect those that can't. And rent control is one of the key ways that they can do that.
Well, I really appreciate you being with us today, Peter, and thank you for your continued leadership on this fight for housing for all.
Thanks so much for having me.